Todd, I want to talk to you about two nations here as we get going on here, and Isaac and Gary then pose questions to you. But there are two nations that are really standing out perhaps more in the news in these days regarding their involvement in persecution. I'd like to get an update from you on them now. One, we're certainly hearing about China, and with their extensively implemented and integrated almost 24/7 monitoring of their citizens, it's very disturbing what we are hearing. Can you give us an update from what you know about the Voice of the Martyrs contacts about China and in China? What's happening there? What can you tell us?
Well, it is very disturbing, and you mentioned the monitoring of people. Our contacts have told us in China that the Chinese government, their goal by the end of next year is to have 600 million surveillance cameras active in the country. Now, if you think about 1.2 billion Chinese people, 600 million is basically one camera for every two people in China. Their goal is to be able to identify and locate anyone on Chinese soil in 3 seconds. So surveillance cameras, facial recognition software. Think about if you're a house church, an underground church pastor in China. Think about if you're trying to secretly deliver Bibles to Christians in China. You know the government is watching. Here's the other side of that coin, though. I had the chance to sit down with a house church pastor in China. We recorded an interview that we aired on Voice of the Martyrs radio and on our podcast. And I said, hey, Pastor, you know the government is always watching. How does that make you feel? How does that affect your ministry? And he said, we do know the government is watching. And he said, what I have told the men in my church is, hey, the government is watching you. Make sure there is not a gap between your testimony on Sunday and the way you live your life the other 6 days of the week. We want the government to know the gospel is true, and they're watching us. So we have an opportunity to live out the gospel. We have an opportunity to be an example of how Jesus changes people's lives and changes people's hearts. Since they're watching anyway, let's use this as an opportunity to witness. So, yes, the persecution is harsh. Yes, the surveillance is harsh. But the believers there are saying, hey, if the government's watching anyway, let's use it as an opportunity.
That's incredible. It reminds me of the Apostle Paul when he was praising the Lord for being bound to, to these Roman soldiers that he could witness to them 24/7. Now I guess it's Big Brother over there doing that. The guest that was on our program just a few minutes ago, John Dickerson, in his book For Skeptics, he talks about the fact that the countries that have the most freedom for women and, best human rights, that they are Christian countries founded on Christian principles. And the top 10 worst human rights, he shows they all persecute Christians, which is no surprise to you at Voice of the Martyrs. But you talked about China. Can you talk about Iran? That's another one of those big ones where Christianity, there's really seems to be a growth of people, like a revival waiting to happen there. But as far as the government goes, they're trying to crack down and they're really persecuting Christians. Could you maybe expound upon that for us?
Absolutely. They are certainly persecuting the church, but they can't stop it. This is one of the amazing things, and frankly, the government of Iran is nervous about that. They are scared because whatever they do, they can't stop the growth of the church. One of the most sort of counterintuitive things that I think I've ever heard is having Iranian Christians tell me that the greatest Christian missionary in the history of Iran was Ayatollah Khomeini. And we hear that and we say, well, wait a minute, he's the one who led the Islamic Revolution. How could he be the greatest Christian missionary? And they will go on to say, well, over the last 40 years since that revolution, our government has told us everything we're doing is according to Islamic principles. Everything we're doing is according to the Quran. We are going to run our country exactly how Muhammad would run it if he was still alive. 40 years later, the country is broken. The economy is in shambles. There is so much corruption in the government. The drug addiction rate of the people is one of the highest in the world. And the people say, well, wait a minute. If this is what 40 years of doing it the Islamic way leads to, then Islam doesn't work. Look, we've got the proof. We can look at our own country and we can see Islam doesn't work. So I've heard estimates as high as 70% of Iranians have rejected Islam. They would tell you, if they could have an honest conversation, Islam doesn't work. I don't believe it. So the gospel is then going in and finding fertile soil and finding open hearts because they've already rejected Islam. they already have a mindset that there is a God, there is one God, and so if you can present Jesus as the Son of God, and many times they have a supernatural encounter with Jesus, and they say, wow, Jesus is God, and that fertile soil, that seed just grows and produces fruit. There is so much hunger for the gospel, but as you say, there is persecution. The government's cracking down. They are particularly focusing on leaders within house groups, leaders within churches, and they're facing arrest. They're facing intense pressure. And one of the challenges, and this is a point for prayer for the people who are listening, once a person has been arrested, it is very hard for them to get back involved with the church because the other people in the church know, hey, this guy got arrested. The government is watching him. If I invite him over to my house for fellowship, if I invite him over to my house, the government's going to start watching me too. And so once someone is arrested, there is a real sense of isolation that they experience. And that's a part of the persecution that we don't think about. We think about, hey, if you're out of jail, then your persecution is over. But that's another part of it, and that's something we can pray about for our Iranian brothers and sisters.